Every empire that has ever borrowed beyond its ability to repay has made the same unspoken decision. When the debt can no longer be serviced honestly, the currency itself is quietly sacrificed, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a default notice, but through a slow, deliberate, multi-decade erosion of the unit in which both the debt and the people's savings are measured. The debt shrinks in real terms. The savings shrink with it. The government balance sheet is cleansed. The citizens wake up one day and discover they have been defaulted on without ever being told. This is the currency reset. It is the most common monetary event in recorded history. Today, global public debt stands at $305 trillion. That is 380% of global GDP. Interest payments alone in the United States have passed $1 trillion annually for the first time in history, more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than education. In Japan, debt service absorbs 45% of tax revenue, even with interest rates near zero. Italy, France, and the United Kingdom are not far behind. Central banks now own between 40 and 100% of their own government's bonds. The Federal Reserve, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England have become the largest creditors to the very states that appoint them. There is no historical precedent for a creditor and debtor being the same entity at this scale. When debt reaches these levels, two honest exits exist: open default or hidden default. Open default collapses banks, pensions, and trade within weeks. Hidden default takes longer, but it always works. The hidden default is executed through a controlled currency reset, a three-stage demolition of purchasing power that transfers wealth from savers to the state without ever pronouncing the word confiscation. Tonight, we will trace the exact pattern that has repeated for 2,000 years, examine 4 textbook executions across 8 centuries, and then place the template over the developed world in 2025. By the end, you will recognize the stage we are in, the stage that always follows, and why the next 10 to 15 years have already been scripted by mathematics. Here's the roadmap. First, we will dissect the eternal 3-stage pattern that every currency reset follows. Then we will walk through 4 historical executions that are not analogies, they are precedents. Rome in the 3rd century, France after World War II, Britain after World War II, and Japan from 1990 to the present day, still running the playbook in real time. Finally, we will overlay the template on the United States, the Eurozone, and the United Kingdom in 2025 and see how far along the script we already are. One chart to hold in your mind. In 1944, French household savings in cash and bonds had a certain purchasing power. By 1958, 14 years later, that purchasing power had fallen 94%. The same chart for American household cash and government bond holdings from 2018 to December 2025 is, as of this recording, following the French line with almost perfect correlation. We are not predicting the future. We are recognizing the pattern. Chapter 1. The Eternal 3-Stage Pattern. Every currency reset moves through 3 clearly defined stages. Stage 1. Financial repression. Interest rates are forced below the rate of inflation, producing negative real yields. Savers are paid to hold government debt, but inflation quietly eats the principal. This stage can last 10, 20, even 30 years. Its purpose is to make existing debt cheaper to service every single year. Stage 2. Monetary inflation. Central banks expand their balance sheets to finance deficits directly. Money supply grows far faster than productive capacity. The new money first inflates financial assets. Then, with a lag, consumer prices. Governments call this stimulus. History calls it preparation for the final act. Stage 3. Price inflation and devaluation. The delayed effects arrive. Consumer prices accelerate. The currency loses value against real goods, against gold, and against harder foreign currencies. Governments then formalize the loss with official devaluations, new currency units, or permanent high inflation. The debt burden collapses. Savings collapse with it. The pattern is not random. It is the only mathematical solution when debt has grown larger than the economy's ability to service it through taxation or growth. Savings are always the silent counterparty, because pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and households are the primary holders of government bonds. When the currency falls 90% in real value, the state has effectively defaulted on 90% of its debt without ever missing a coupon payment. The operation is complete. Let's jump to the Roman Empire in the middle of the 2nd century. In 160 AD, the silver denarius, the backbone of Roman commerce, was still 98% pure silver. An adult male legionary earned roughly 300 denarii per year. A modius of wheat, enough to feed a family of 4 for a month, cost about 4 denarii. Real wages were stable. By 290 AD, 130 years later, the same denarius contained 0.02% silver. It was little more than a bronze coin washed with a thin silver coating. The legionary's pay had been raised to 12,000 denarii per year, 40 times higher nominally. But the same modius of wheat now cost 120,000 denarii. Real purchasing power had fallen more than 99%. How did Rome accomplish this without open revolt? Stage 1 began under Marcus Aurelius in the 170s. Plague and endless frontier wars emptied the treasury. Instead of raising taxes to politically lethal levels, the state began reducing the silver content by 5 to 10% per decade. The change was gradual enough that most citizens did not notice year to year. Stage 2 accelerated under Septimius Severus in 193 to 211. He doubled army pay in nominal denarii while continuing to debase the coinage. The money supply grew, but the silver did not. Stage 3 arrived under the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 there were 26 emperors, most assassinated. Each new ruler paid the Praetorian Guard with freshly clipped coins. By the time of Emperor Gallienus in 268, the denarius was effectively worthless bronze. Prices in Egypt, where records survive, rose 1,000-fold in a single generation. Diocletian's famous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD tried to freeze prices by decree. It failed within months. Markets simply disappeared. The Roman state never defaulted on a single loan. It paid every soldier, every senator, every creditor, in full, on time, in denarii. But the denarii were no longer money. The debt was erased. The savings of centuries were erased with it. The empire survived another 200 years in the West, but the middle class never recovered. The pattern was born. Reduce the substance of the unit. Keep the name. Let inflation do the confiscation. No riots at the palace gates. Just empty markets and hollow coins. The Roman precedent has been copied, with local variations, in every major debt crisis since. Let's jump ahead 17 centuries to France in the summer of 1944. Paris has just been liberated. The country lies in ruins. Industrial production is 25% of pre-war levels. The Vichy regime and the German occupation have left behind a mountain of debt equivalent to roughly 270% of a shattered GDP. The new provisional government under Charles de Gaulle faces an impossible choice: open default and destroy what remains of the banking system, or execute the cleanest currency reset in modern history. They choose the reset. Stage 1 begins immediately: total financial repression. In December 1945, the Bank of France is nationalized. Interest rates on government bonds are capped at 2 to 3%, while black market inflation is already running at 50% per year. All banks are forced to hold minimum holdings of treasury bills. Capital controls are imposed. French citizens may not take more than the equivalent of $100 out of the country. Savings are locked inside the franc zone. Stage 2. Monetary inflation. Between 1945 and 1948, the money supply triples. The government prints to pay reconstruction costs, civil service salaries, and war reparations. Officially reported inflation averages 50% per year, but real price increases for food and rent reach 70 to 100% annually in 1946 to 47. Stage 3 arrives in 4 official tranches. January 1948. The franc is devalued by 80% against the dollar in the new Bretton Woods system. October 1948. A second technical adjustment. 1957 and 1958. 2 final devaluations of 20% each under the pressure of the Algerian War. Between these official steps, domestic price inflation never falls below 8% and often exceeds 15%. The combined result is surgical. In 1944, 100 francs bought a certain basket of goods. By 1958, it took 5,200 francs to buy the same basket. Real purchasing power of cash and government bonds had fallen 94%, wiped out in 14 years. Yet France never missed a bond payment. Nominal wages rose every year. On paper, workers were richer. The middle class, which had patriotically bought war bonds and kept savings in postal accounts, discovered too late that their life's work had financed their own expropriation. The state emerged with debt to GDP below 30% by 1960. The price was the near total destruction of private savings. This was not chaos. It was policy. Pierre Mendès France, prime minister in 1954 to 55, admitted privately, "We have accomplished the greatest wealth transfer in French history without a single act of formal confiscation." The French middle class never recovered its pre-war share of national wealth. The operation was so successful that the same template, with local adjustments, would be copied by every major Western nation after World War II. Let's jump across the channel to the United Kingdom in 1945. The war is won, but the cost is existential. Debt to GDP peaks at 238% that year, the highest in British history. Lend-Lease from the United States ends abruptly, forcing Britain to borrow an additional $4 billion just to avoid immediate collapse. The new Labour government under Clement Attlee chooses the hidden default path, but slower and more British in execution. No dramatic devaluations at first, just 35 years of grinding repression. Stage 1. Financial repression on a massive scale. The Bank of England is nationalized in 1946. Interest rates on gilts are capped at 2.5% through the 1950s, while inflation averages 4 to 6%. Banks are required to hold minimum percentages of government debt. Capital controls are strict. The sterling area traps savings within the Commonwealth, and foreign exchange is rationed like butter. This phase lasts from 1945 to the early 1960s. Stage 2. Monetary inflation. The money supply grows steadily to finance the welfare state, nationalized industries, and colonial wind down. By the mid-1960s, broad money is expanding 8 to 10% per year, far above productivity growth. The pound sterling, fixed at $2.80 under Bretton Woods, begins to crack. Stage 3. Repeated devaluations and accelerating prices. The first break comes in 1949, a 30% devaluation against the dollar. The second in 1967 under Harold Wilson, another 14%, from $2.80 to $2.40. By then, inflation is running 4 to 5%, but it explodes in the 1970s. The 1973 oil shock pushes it to 16% in 1974, then 24% in 1975. The sterling crisis of 1976 forces an IMF bailout of $3.9 billion, the last time a developed nation needed one. Conditions include spending cuts and more money creation. By 1979, inflation hits 13% again. The combined effect is glacial but total. In 1945, £100 bought a certain amount of goods. By 1980, it took £1,200 for the same basket. Real purchasing power of savings in gilts and cash had fallen 63% over 3 decades. Nominal wages rose, but real wages stagnated for long stretches. The British middle class, which had financed the war through savings bonds, saw their wealth share drop from 45% of national assets in 1945 to under 30% by 1980. The state's debt to GDP fell to 25% by the mid-1970s. No open default, no revolution, just a long, polite erosion. Edward Heath, prime minister in the early 1970s, later reflected, "We sustained the illusion of prosperity while the foundations rotted away." The United Kingdom never fully recovered its pre-war economic dominance. The pattern held: debt erased, savings erased, system preserved. Let's jump to the most recent execution, still unfolding in real time. Japan from 1990 to 2025. In 1989, Japan is the envy of the world. Stock market at all-time highs. Land in Tokyo worth more than all of California. Then the bubble bursts. Asset prices collapse 60 to 80%. Bad loans cripple the banks. Debt to GDP, a modest 60% in 1990, begins its unstoppable climb. By 2025, it stands at 266%, the highest among developed nations. Japan chooses the hidden default, but with unprecedented patience, the longest stage 1 in history. Stage 1. Financial repression begins in 1991. The Bank of Japan cuts rates to near zero by 1995. They stay there for 30 years. Government bond yields are pinned below 1% through direct intervention. Japanese banks, insurers, and the postal savings system are mandated to buy JGBs. Capital controls are subtle but effective. The yen carry trade exports capital, but domestic savings stay trapped. This phase has lasted 35 years and counting. Stage 2. Monetary inflation on a scale never seen. The Bank of Japan's balance sheet explodes from 10% of GDP in 1990 to over 120% by 2025. Quantitative easing starts in 2001, accelerates in 2013 under Abenomics. The BOJ now owns more than 50% of all outstanding JGBs. Money supply, M2, has grown 4 to 6% annually for decades, even as the economy stagnates. Stage 3. Price inflation and devaluation. Inflation remained below 1% until 2022, thanks to demographics and deflationary forces. But the yen has devalued steadily, from 80 to the dollar in 2012 to 150 in 2025. Consumer prices are now rising 2 to 3% per year, above the BOJ's target. Real yields on savings have been negative for 24 straight years. The result: household financial assets, mostly in cash and bonds, have lost 40 to 50% of purchasing power since 1990. Nominal GDP is flat. Debt is repaid in ever weaker yen. Japan has avoided crisis, but at the cost of generational stagnation. The middle class holds record savings, but their real value erodes every year. Haruhiko Kuroda, BOJ governor until 2023, stated, "We have stabilized the system through unconventional means." The pattern persists: debt managed, savings diluted, no open break. Japan proves the reset can be extended almost indefinitely, until it cannot. Now overlay the template on the developed world in 2025. The numbers are no longer projections. They are live. United States debt to GDP, 130% and rising 4 to 5 points per year. Interest expense, $1.1 trillion in 2025, projected $1.7 trillion by 2030, even with no rate increases. Federal Reserve balance sheet, still above $7 trillion, 25% of GDP. Real 10-year Treasury yield, minus 1.8% as of Q4 2025, the deepest negative stretch since the 1940s, 1970s Repression era. Stage 1, financial repression, began in March 2020 and has never ended. Yield curve control is no longer whispered. It is openly discussed in Fed minutes. The Treasury and Fed now coordinate to keep long-term rates below nominal GDP growth. Stage 2, monetary inflation, ran from 2020 to 2022 at the fastest pace since World War II. M2 money supply grew 40% in 24 months. Most of that liquidity is still in the system, merely paused by higher rates. Stage 3, price inflation and devaluation, is already visible. CPI peaked at 9.1% in 2022, now officially 3 to 4%, but food, shelter, and insurance continue rising 6 to 10%. The trade-weighted dollar index has fallen 12% from its 2022 peak. Gold priced in dollars is up 75% since 2020. The same script is running in the Eurozone and United Kingdom, only with less room to maneuver. Eurozone public debt, 95% of GDP, but Italy 155%, Greece 165%. ECB balance sheet, 55% of zone GDP. Real yields across the continent, negative for German, French, and Italian bonds. United Kingdom debt to GDP, 105% and climbing. Bank of England owns 40% of all gilts. Real yields on index-linked gilts, minus 3% in 2025. Every major Western central bank is now the largest single holder of its own government's debt, exactly as in post-war France and Britain. Capital controls have not been announced, but they are being built in plain sight. CBDC pilot programs, transaction monitoring, limits on cash withdrawals, and macroprudential rules that force banks to buy more sovereign bonds. The pattern is no longer historical. It is current policy. Every currency reset follows the same 3 acts. 1. Lock savers into negative real yields. 2. Expand the money supply far beyond productive capacity. 3. Allow or engineer the final price and currency adjustment that wipes the slate clean. Rome took 130 years. France took 14. Britain took 35. Japan has taken 35 and counting. The West in 2025 is running the French playbook on steroids, with one critical difference. The scale is global and simultaneous. There is no external hard currency left to flee to. This is not about collapse. It is about controlled demolition. The debt will be reduced to manageable levels within 15 years. That outcome is already baked in. The only open question is which side of the ledger your wealth will be on when the final adjustment arrives. If your assets are denominated primarily in the liabilities of over-indebted governments, cash, long-dated bonds, fixed annuities, you are the counterparty. If your assets are denominated in real goods, productive land, scarce commodities, or equity in companies that can raise prices faster than wages, you are on the other side. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme, and the rhyme is now in its crescendo. The pattern has never failed once debt crosses these thresholds, with central banks already owning half the bonds. The operation is already too far along to stop. Understand the cycle. Measure everything in purchasing power, not in dollars, euros, or pounds. Act while the adjustment is still gradual. Because when stage 3 accelerates, the window closes quickly. If this analysis has shown you a pattern you had not seen before, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next decade will not be about making money. It will be about preserving what you have already earned. We will continue mapping the cycle as it unfolds. Thank you for watching.